So these four cans here are the primers and sealers that I use. The two on the left are flat white and flat black, and that's what we're going to be dealing with today. So give the primer a good shake, good 10-15 seconds if you can. So just kind of spray it around, again, lightly. Normally you want to be 6 to 8 inches away from the miniature, but with the wind kicking up when I was out there, I had to be a little bit closer. Make sure to get the base as well. And if you miss a spot, you can always go back and touch it up. I think with this one, I may have missed something on the shoulder, but I went back and corrected it. So that's the final black priming. See how that looks? It's pretty impressive, just black. And then I go over it with a light coat of white to highlight some of the details to help me figure out what components of the miniature I want to paint. And so the finished product is pretty nice. You have definition on his shoulders and his head and some of the armor pieces, and you get to see some detail you wouldn't see with just a black priming. You see his forehead is nicely highlighted. So this is the finished product. Looks pretty good, and I think it's about ready to paint. One thing I will say is do not use too much primer. Alright, so now that we're back in the studio, I wanted to kind of go through some of the components that I use when I paint. Obviously, brushes are part of this whole thing, but there are some other elements here that might help you. So a cup here that I keep water in. You want to try and keep your brushes clean and try and make sure that they're a little moist when you use them, except for certain applications like dry brushing. I also have a palette, which can be anything as simple as a plastic lid, a plate, anything that is not going to be absorbent. So I wouldn't use cardboard or a piece of paper for a palette, only because it tends to absorb moisture and it'll dry your paints out faster. Now there are other ways to get around paints drying on you. Using something like plastic to do your painting is, or to mix your paints and as your palette, is going to be probably one of the easiest ones. There's also something called a wet palette, which I'll get into at some point, but right now a simple piece of plastic, again, or a ceramic plate or a tile for that matter. I know that the Cave Troll uses like a ceramic tile. The other things that I have here besides the brushes are, I have this is a medicine bottle. What I do is I use these as holders for the miniature. What I do is I take this as poster board tack. A piece off of there. I have a piece over here. I stick it to the top like that, and then I affix my miniature. And that's a horrible little miniature. In the background you can hear Bart, my cat. He gets lonely, has separation anxiety, but I can't have him in here. So this is a little miniature that I use for test paints, but that way, you know, when you're kind of going through the process here, you can manipulate it and move it around. And so it could be any type of bottle, whatever fits your hand better. I have other medicine bottles that I use. These are great. But anything will do. So poster board tack. This stuff is super inexpensive. You can get a bunch of it for $4 or $5. It's reusable. My biggest issue with it is that a lot of times when I'm priming, I'll get primer on it, and sometimes it doesn't stick quite as well after that. But it's inexpensive, easy to use, and it doesn't leave residue or anything behind on whatever you put it on. So that's pretty awesome. This is called the Masters Brush Cleaner and Preserver. I highly recommend it. I use it after almost every painting session. And all you do is you open it up, and inside you see kind of a cream there. You put a couple drops of water in there, and you'll swirl your brush around, and it will clean it, pull all of the paint out, condition the bristles, and then you just rinse it out and let it dry. So as far as what's left on the table, I have an X-Acto knife. These come in handy for cleaning up mold lines. So sometimes during the process of miniatures being created, if they're injection molded, you'll see little mold lines. Right where those molds come together, you'll have a little squirtle of, yeah, I said squirtle, a little squirtle of plastic. And so you can take this and you basically end up going over just with a scraping motion. I wouldn't necessarily cut. You can if you want to, but you have to be careful. These are really sharp. But kind of scrape along those mold lines, get the excess plastic off. You don't see the cleanup being as necessary with some of the newer manufacturing processes, but this also comes in handy when you're doing Warhammer miniatures or miniatures that are coming on a sprue, because you have to separate them off the sprue and then you have to clean up those sprue lines as well. So this is very helpful for that. If you're dealing with sprue-based models, there are some snippers that you can get that will accomplish that process a little bit better than using this to get them off the sprue, and then use this to go ahead and clean up the sprue lines or what have you. The brushes that I have in front of me are just a selection of some of my favorites. The manufacturer doesn't matter as much. These are Army Painter brushes. I like them. I like the triangular handles. Helps me really kind of control what I'm doing. They also come in round handles as well. These are, this particular one is, they've labeled it as Insane Detail. So let me see if I can. So this is a very, very fine brush you would use for faces or very, very small details on a miniature. These are important to have. And they're not always the easiest things to work with. Because they are so fine, if you don't kind of draw the paint off the brush, you end up with big old globules, and that negates the fact that they're so fine bristled. Then you end up with this big blob of paint. So you got to be careful with these when you use them. I have dry brushes. These are actually 2 dry brushes. Dry brushes are probably one of the few brushes that I would recommend that you actually purchase that are specialty. The reason being, dry brushing wreaks havoc on regular brushes. These are specifically built for it. They are firm bristle, short bristle brushes, and they allow you to do this dusting motion very nicely without applying paint where you don't want to apply it for the most part. And dry brushing can be very, very inaccurate. So, but these brushes help mitigate that a little bit. Then we have a standard painting brush. What you'd use to apply base coats, things like that. And this is just another standard brush. This one, if you notice, I think it's starting to, might be about time to think about replacing it. I don't know. We'll see how it performs. A lot of times when you see those bristles start to flare out like that and you're losing your point, it's time to retire the brush. And my thought is never throw away a brush unless the bristles are physically falling out of it. Hold on to it. You can use it as a mixing brush when you're mixing your paints together. You can use it for all sorts of things. For these that were the bristles are starting to go, I'll use those as wet brushes. Sometimes for wet blending, sometimes for cleanup. One of the techniques I use to get paint off of areas where I didn't mean to apply it and it's still wet is you can either take a dry brush and just kind of scrub it, or you can wet the brush and try and dilute the paint and then absorb it off the surface. So these brushes are, when they start to go, those are really good for that. So don't throw away your brushes, hold on to them. They'll serve you many purposes, believe me. One of the other things that I keep next to me is paper. So as I'm mixing,
I'll test paints out on this. I'll test thicknesses of paints out. So if you're going to be doing a wash, you'll want to make sure that it's thin enough to be transparent but still has some pigment in it. When you're dry brushing, you want to make sure that you don't have very much paint on the brush, so you can test it here and kind of flare off that paint. Comes in handy for sure. And I also keep a bottle of water, a dropper bottle of water. The water I use to thin out paints, very important. And this dropper bottle, you can buy these bottles anywhere. When it comes to Reaper paints, which is what I'm using, in one of their kits it actually came with an empty bottle, so that came in handy. That's basically all we're going to be using for these next couple videos, but I wanted to introduce you to everything that you're going to see me use, so that way you understand what I have and why I'm using it. Thanks, everybody.